So, my path in music has taken a very new twist over the last 6 months into electronic music and this electronic wind instrument called the Sylphyo. What I was playing was an improvisation based on a traditional melody, but the sound was not coming out of this instrument. It was actually coming out of my laptop. A couple of weeks ago, I recorded actual sounds on this instrument. This is an 1892 cedar Native American flute, Wichiyena culture, Yankton Lakota as we know it. And I made a sample library out of these recordings. These are sample recordings that I then loaded into my laptop with a sampler, and I was playing this instrument, which then tells the laptop what notes I'm playing and what my breath is and everything about the way I'm playing, including the way the instrument is oriented, and the laptop is rendering my playing into those sound samples, using those sound samples into the music you hear. This video is on the basics of how electronic music works and how this area might be useful in the native flute community. Well, how did I get into this? Our community has a lot of irreplaceable, unique, historic instruments, and I got the idea that we could use this approach to preserve those sounds. We could build sound libraries, record those instruments and build sound libraries, and release them and make them generally available to the community. So what is this instrument? It's produced by a company in France called Aodyo, spelled A-O-D-Y-O, and it's got pads that work like finger holes. I breathe through the instrument, and the breath goes through the center of the instrument and comes out the bottom, but it produces sound in a completely different way. The instrument interprets everything I'm doing with my fingers and my breath and the position of the instrument in the air, including elevation and orientation, left, right, and roll, right? I can roll the instrument, and it produces sound based on all those inputs, right? So the sound itself comes from many different sources. And one of the things we'll do in this video is look at lots of sources for the actual sound. The first source comes from within the instrument itself. So now I'm over at my computer, and there's a diagram of what my setup is. My headphones are plugged into, by wire, the bottom of the Sylphyo, and I could just as well plug the Sylphyo into any audio system, any mixer, any amplifier, any house system. There's a small screen on the instrument which allows me to select 35 internal sounds, and here's one of them. So this is the classic analog synthesizer sound. Analog synths build their sounds from basic sine waves, saw waves, square waves, simple oscillators that get morphed and shaped by various filters. But I have a lot of expressive power here. I can control not only my breath, but I can control the orientation of the instrument. I can raise it, and if I raise the foot up, the sound gets thicker. And rolling the instrument changes the timbre of the sound. It makes the sound darker by removing harmonics. We also have a lot of range. This is 7 octaves. Notice I can also bend the note. I can also raise my finger just like on a native flute. Yeah, there is a slight tick. This is still a beta feature. Aodyo is working on smoothing that out, and that's a key feature for native flutes, right? Because we bend that note all the time. Now, in the world of electronic music, a set of 35 sounds is pretty limiting. So what we want to do is change our setup to using this instrument as what's called a MIDI controller. We want to have the Sylphyo control some external device that actually generates the sound, and it's going to do that by sending a stream of data, MIDI data, M-I-D-I, that has everything about the way I'm playing it, my fingers and my breath and the orientation of the instrument in the air, and it's going to send it to some external device that's going to create the sound. And the first device we're going to look at is a hardware unit that all it does is take MIDI data from a MIDI controller and render sound. So the first thing I've done is remove the wire, big improvement for playing flutes. The Sylphyo is now, instead of sending audio data, it's sending MIDI data by radio interface to a box called a link. The link receives the MIDI over radio interface very fast, and sends it by wire to a unit built by Yamaha called a Motif-Rack ES. Motif-Rack ES takes MIDI data, its entire job is to take MIDI data and generate sound. And how it does it, it's completely different than the synthesizers we talked about. Synthesizers used oscillator waves and modified them. Motif-Rack has in it recorded sound samples, high quality sound samples of real instruments. When I play the Sylphyo, generate MIDI data, the job of the Motif-Rack is to render that as its best approximation of the instrument that it has the sound samples for. I've dialed in the sound samples for a clarinet, and this is what it sounds like. So, what's happening here? It's not quite right because, well, what are we hearing? We're hearing when I hit a note, the Motif-Rack is holding the volume of the note steady for the entire duration of the note. Whether I breathe louder, whether I breathe harder or softer, doesn't matter. No change in the volume of the note as I hold the note. Also, as I change notes, every single note is attacked as if I did a ta attack. What's happening here? Okay. It took me a long time. I wrestled with this, and I came to realize that most of these units that generate sound from MIDI data, the vast majority of them are designed for keyboard players, keyboard MIDI controllers. Often if you say MIDI controller, people will assume it's a keyboard MIDI controller, not a wind controller, okay? Keyboards, think about a keyboard. You hit a note, it's on for the whole time that you hold down that note, and then it releases when you release the key. What the Motif-Rack is doing is using my initial attack volume, my initial breath pressure, to set the note for the entire duration of the note, and doesn't process the changing breath pressure that I'm putting into the instrument. This instrument is generating stream of MIDI data, I think it's like 500 times a second. It samples how much breath pressure I'm putting and sends that information 500 times a second. Motif-Rack is not taking that because it's designed for keyboards. It's not using that information, okay? So these are major shortcomings. Also, when I change notes, it's as if I hit another key, so it's always using a attack at the beginning of the note. Motif-Rack doesn't understand the difference between articulated attacks, like a ta or a ha or a ka, when I interrupt my breath and I put a into the note, it doesn't understand connected notes. Okay, so it assumes every note is disconnected and puts a ta attack on it. So the sounds are good, but it's not really working with a breath controller. Okay, we're back with a hardware change, but before we get into that, I'd like to point out a feature of the foot of the instrument. There's a plug-in here that I've inserted into a port in the bell of the instrument, on the foot of the instrument, and that's where the breath comes out. And a lot of people who play this instrument put in a plug to reduce the amount of airflow that comes out and increase the back pressure that the player feels. Back pressure is very important in wind instruments. I think we have a flute cast on back pressure, and finding the right flute that has the back pressure that you like is very important. Well, with this instrument, you have the option of putting in a plug, and these plugs have different sizes. I actually 3D printed these, and there are, I think, 8 different sizes of airways to give different back pressures, and you just put the plug in. And if you want more back pressure, swap it out for a plug that has a narrower opening. So that's very useful. Okay, back to the hardware change. We've swapped out the Motif-Rack for another Yamaha unit, the VL70M, first released in 1996. On its own, it's pretty much the same as the Motif-Rack, yes, in that it is designed for keyboard players and doesn't use the breath pressure in the way that wind players are used to. This unit, though, has a secret sauce. The brains of the unit have been swapped out. There's a chip in there that's been removed and a replacement chip provided by Patchman Music, a very important company in sound design. In particular, Matt Traum designed this chip that I've replaced in the VL70M, and it makes the unit work beautifully with the Sylphyo and wind controllers in general. Here's the sound of the clarinet from the VL70M. So this is a much better rendition of what a real clarinet sounds like. The unit has a completely different approach, though, to generating sound. It is not a sampler. It does not have real-world sound samples inside it. It's called a physical modeling engine. Physical modeling engines work completely differently. They don't use sound samples, they use equations. They use equations that describe the shape of the instrument, particularly the shape of the bore, the shape of the sound mechanism, right? All the physical characteristics. If it's a reed instrument, they have equations that model how the reed vibrates. A string instrument would have a model of how the soundboard vibrates. So this is a completely different approach to sound generation. And here are some images that show the internal structure of the VL70M. These were done by Rudy Verpale of Emax Plus. It's a Belgian outfit that builds, well, in this case, they built an editor for the internal sounds of this unit, of the VL70M. The message here is, not to get into these diagrams, it's just to demonstrate that it is really complicated to set up a physical modeling engine. The results, however, when they're done well, they can be awesome. However, this is not getting us closer to being able to actually play Native American flute sounds. To do that, I had to develop my own sound libraries. Now, this has some advantages. Virtual instruments don't use microphones, so there's no dealing with ambient noise when you perform or record. It can also be set up to be perfectly in pitch. Whatever pitch or scale you're using, your notes are always in tune. And Virtual instruments have the possibility to extend the range of the instruments. Native American flutes are inherently limited in range, but you can set up a sound library so it has an extended range. There's also the possibility of layering sounds, playing multiple sounds at the same time. You can play the same instrument, having, for instance, a lead over a drone sound, or you can play completely different instruments at the same time and play a lead over a synthesizer pad or something like that. So, based on this, I dove in and recorded 9 of my flutes, recorded sound samples on them, individual notes, and built sound libraries. So in order to use the Native Flute sound libraries, we're in the realm of using a laptop as our sound generating device. I'm using a Windows laptop. People use Macs and tablets these days. I think you can even do it on an iPhone device. However, the first wrinkle is you can't simply plug your headphones or your sound system right into the audio jack of your computer. There's a nasty issue called latency. Imagine you're watching a movie and you see somebody clap their hands. You hear the clap at the same time, okay? Now, imagine you saw somebody clap their hands, but you heard the clap a second or a half a second later. Very disconcerting. If you're playing your instrument and you hear the sound transitions coming a half a second or a second later, it's impossible to play. Most people can't do that. So we add a dedicated audio interface. Most musicians will use an audio interface, a high-quality audio interface that reduces the latency as much as possible to near zero, and they're often called, for that reason, zero latency audio interfaces. This makes everything, of course, a bit more complex, and the complexity does not end there, because now my computer looks like this. So on the left side of the screen, we have a Contact running, the sampler, and it's got 7 sound libraries loaded, 7 of the flutes, of my flutes that I recorded. The upper right, there's a reverb unit, which is a convolution reverb unit, which emulates the sound of a real space. Recordings done in real spaces are then used to recreate the sound of that space. So the action is happening on the left side. At the bottom, the soloed instrument, the one with the little green symbol, is a SuoNAF, CG, Klinkas, and the SuoNAF, that's the original piece I played at the beginning. That's the sound sample I played at the beginning, which is the 1892 flute. So it sounds again like this. And you can see the level meters going as I'm playing. Always very comforting to see the level meters come up. And the interesting part is you can open that one, and we'll look at the internals of it. So this is what the internals look like. Up at the top, we've got 2 groups, attack and sustain, and the attack group is for and the sustain is for a legato note, a second note that follows that first. In the middle, you can see it going back and forth between the various sound samples that I've recorded, and you can actually see those sound samples, the waveforms of those sound samples being executed by the sampler in real time. These are all the waveforms they're not waveforms, they're breath profiles. They map the breath from the MIDI onto different aspects. There's one here that's interesting. It maps, the second one from the top maps my breath pressure onto pitch. Remember, when you breathe softer, it goes flat. When you breathe harder, it goes sharp, and this emulates that effect. As I breathe less, that second from the top, you can see it's on the left side. As I increase my breath pressure, it goes up to the right side, and that's mapping a pitch shift from slightly flat to slightly sharp as I vary my breath pressure. Now, important thing about this particular sound sample is it's very limited in range because I emulated just the notes of the original flute. I made them the pitch range a little bit wider. It's a C minor. I think I brought it down to a mid A minor, so another 3 semitones down below the original bottom note and a few semitones above the top note on the flute. But if you go too low, the notes stop. So that's something to know about that. These sound samples that emulate a particular flute and only that flute, you have the limited range that you have on the original instrument. Okay, we'll come down a little bit more. This is a very interesting, that breath curve near the top, that's mapping the raw input that comes out from the wind controller onto how much volume we have. Okay, so and I have a very particular curve there because I want to be able to play extremely softly and still have the notes sound good. So I've set that breath curve so that there's no grittiness at the bottom end. So I hear a very smooth transition off into silence, which is something we do a lot in native flutes. That's particular to the instrument. And these are various effects down here. I've turned off the convolution reverb inside of Contact. The one that is available out on Flutopedia, that has the convolution reverb turned on, so it has convolution reverb inside of the sound sample. You can go in just like I did and turn it off. You just turn off this convolution reverb, and you can use your own external reverb the way I'm doing here. So that's the very, very quick tour through what took me weeks and weeks and weeks to develop and get this right, through what it looks like inside a sound sample. And I've got 7 sound libraries. Okay, so let's look at Papago flute. Is a Papago culture flute. And I'm actually going to turn off the convolution reverb on the outside because it's got its own convolution reverb turned on. That's the sound of the original instrument with reverb, of course. You can, of course, turn off that reverb to get the original sound. Yeah, looking for my cursor there. I'm going to turn on the Myrtle. I'm going up from the bottom, so we're third from the bottom. Myrtle is a more modern flute. You notice I've extended the range significantly for that instrument by using, it's a composite of several flutes, and I'm also extending the range by doing pitch shifting in the sampler, which is something samplers are very good at. There's the Jaleika, which is not a native flute. Instrument we got in Morocco. Cypress is a native flute, and it's a more traditional sounding instrument. Not pure traditional, but more traditional. It's got more of a ta attack at the beginning. A cherry naff is a set of 3 flutes I recorded. Again, with a modern sound, a different modern sound. So I think, well, at least two of those flutes were cherry, so I'm calling it Cherry Naff. And the final one up at the top is the Beltrami Native American flute. This is a copy of the earliest instrument we have, Native American flute from 1823. It's called the Beltrami flute. It's currently in a museum in Italy. We got the measurements from Jeff Norman, and John Norris made this flute for me. It's as best as we can an emulation of that earliest Native American flute, and I sampled it in the library. Here we go. So that is a tour of the inside of a sample library and 7 of the 9 sound libraries I have. And these are available out on Flutopedia for free download. They're released open source, and the only request is, of course, as part of the Creative Commons license, that attribution. So just say, hey, sound samples by Clint Goss. That's sufficient. Contact is the predominant sampler, especially in the PC world these days. It's made by Native Instruments, but there are other ways to get sound samples rendered. It's possible, sometimes preferable, to build samples directly into their own piece of software. There are plugins. They're often called VSTs. On the PC, on the Mac, they're called AUs, audio units on the Mac, and these are plug-in pieces of software we'll look at. So here is a couple of VSTs by Gino Cementi of SuonoPuro in Italy. Gino's goal is to build virtual instruments with the character of real-world instruments. He's using sound samples, but his goal is to make them even better than the original. This is his emulation of an Armenian duduk, and in the tradition of the duduk, it's the lead combined with a low drone that runs kind of continuously. And I'm actually taking over the very lowest register of this instrument to run the drone, to turn it on and off and to change notes. And everything above that lowest register is the lead of the duduk. And I also have programmed it so as I pick up the bell of the instrument, it brings in the tambura. So there's a tambura on top of it. Armenian duduk. So, of course, we're on a computer now, and that was VSTs that used sound samples, but there's also the possibility to generate sound using a physical modeling technique as a computer-based plugin. And we saw that physical modeling technique with the VL70M, and now we're going to go and use that in a VST plugin. So if you've been watching carefully, you may have noticed that the fingering I'm using is classic Native American flute pentatonic minor fingering. That came about because over about 2 months I worked with Aodyo to develop 2 sets of fingerings for native flute players. There's a basic and an advanced set of fingerings, and this will be the subject of another flute cast coming up later, specifically for the ins and outs of the Native American flute fingering for this instrument. There's a lot of fingerings that you can use. Whatever instrument you currently play, it's probably already programmed into here. You can select it on this screen, and they've got sax and clarinet and flute and recorder and low D whistle and a dozen diatonic fingerings that produce different scales. So it's pretty comprehensive. And what we've got here is this physical modeling engine for a saxophone developed by Chet Singer. There's a bunch of physical modeling engines that he's done, and he releases them for free. Very gracious. He has this set that run under a program called Reactor. And so this is running under Reactor, and what you're going to see if you watch the screen, the upper center 2 indicators. The left one, they're kind of interesting. I watch them as I play them. The left one follows your breath, exactly the breath pressure you're producing, and the right one is the waveform of the output. So this is Chet Singer's physical modeling engine for the sax. Chet Singer also produced excellent emulations of brass instruments that he also released for free. These are done with yet another way to do sound design, to produce emulation libraries, wavetable synthesis. These virtual instruments are ideal for demonstrating layering. I'm going to start with a solo trumpet and then bring in a full brass ensemble. This is using the theme of Fanfare for the Common Man. This also uses 2 timpanis and a Chinese cymbal that I'll play using sound samples that are done in Kontakt. So this is a combination of Chet Singer's brass instruments and sound samples that are done in Kontakt. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the key from what I was playing. I was playing this as an A minor Native American flute. Now I'm playing it as a B flat minor because that was the key that it was originally scored in. So this next plugin is called Respiro. It's a VST done by Rudy Verpali of Emox Plus in Belgium. And Rudy's been doing sound design for a long, long time. And this is his brainchild project to use a physical modeling engine to create new instruments that don't exist in the real world. So on the left, you've got patches, and I've selected Desert Flowers 5 as a patch. And on the right is that wheel controls up to 9 parameters. There's 7 parameters right now on this wheel, and those are adjustable parameters in the current patch you're using. And the patch sounds like this. And now I'm going to go ahead and adjust some of the parameters. We're going to take these noise parameters, and I'm just going to play. You can see how the sound quality changes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come over here and assign I'm going to assign one of the controllers, one of the MIDI controllers coming out of this instrument. I'm going to assign elevation to actually both of these. So I'm going to use the elevation of the instrument. There we go. And it now responds. You see the dots going up and down? Okay, and so now I can control both of those parameters simultaneously just by the elevation. And now if I want to control, let's see, number 4 is this noise tube. Let's see what that does. Not that effective. Number 3 is reed injection. Okay. So this is sort of somewhere between a woodwind instrument and a brass instrument, and the more number 3 you give it, and more reed injection you give it, the more brassy it gets. So let's assign that to roll. I'll do that. I'll do this nice curve. You can set these curves to anything you want. And I'm going to use the MIDI for roll. And now when I roll, see number 3 can go up and down. Gonna have a lot of fun with this one. Okay, I'm going to circle back to synthesizers now. There's this whole world of created synthesizers out there. This one I picked up for free. I picked up a whole package for free of reactor-based synthesizers. They were put up by a Native Instruments user named Wind Player. They're great for wind instruments, not keyboards, right? They're designed for wind instruments. And this one, I'm really not giving the author credit because I don't know who the author is, but it's called Redux, and it's in this package that was distributed by Wind Player. So I'll just do some exploring. You can have a lot of fun with these. And finally, we're back to a hardware unit, the XpressO from Germany, developed by Ingo Scherzinger, who has taken extreme care in recording sound samples. This is a sampler that uses sound samples that may take Ingo 2 hours to record a single note on one instrument. He records them very carefully. He's been doing this for years and years, and applies filters and modulators in the XpressO, like a lot of filters and modulators, to morph the sound and have the sound react like the real instrument. He is emulating real-world instruments. So this is possibly the leading edge of sound design. It's certainly my favorite so far. In terms of, I've only been working with it for about 2 weeks now, so I'm getting at home with this box. This is the sound of a cello, very difficult instrument to emulate. Okay, let me switch the XpressO, reach over my shoulder. You notice I've moved the rig over here now. I've got the XpressO, I've got my laptop set up, the VL70M that you saw before, and the looper that I brought over. I've been using that. We're going to switch to the sound of a solar flute. So this is already a very long video, and kudos to you for sticking with it. But realize that this area of electronic music is vast and deep, and you can go as far down the rabbit hole as you want. I've only played a few of the 280 plus virtual instruments that I've collected over the last 6 months. It should be an Olympic sport, gear acquisition syndrome, right? But one other thing I want to point out is that this is not the only wind controller. There are a lot of current wind controllers that generate MIDI data. Historically, wind controllers go back to the 1970s with the Lyricon, which is fashioned after a soprano sax, and the work of Niles Steiner, who pioneered the electronic valve instrument, a trumpet-based wind controller. So that's about it for our introduction to electronic music and electronic wind instruments. We will have some related videos over the next couple of months on some specifics of the Sylphyo and some specifics of electronic music, and especially the fingerings that apply to native flutes that we've actually programmed into this instrument. You can also go to flutecast.com and look up any of our videos. We have about 80 at this point. And I hope our paths cross in person in a real workshop in a real space sometime down the line. Bye, folks.